New updates in the Sean Diddy Combs legal saga. The rap mogul gets an official sentencing date. He gets hit with allegations from a shocking new lawsuit. A juror speaks out, and also, apparently, Diddy receives a standing ovation from inmates.
The tragedy of Sean Diddy Combs was never just about the man himself. It was always about the wreckage he left behind, and the children forced to stand in the spotlight of his shame. 4 months. We've watched Diddy's sons get pulled into the legal vortex.
I have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs trial, but I'll tell you what, this case, not over. No. Important hearing today, sort of. We got to talk about why. Well, Judge Arun Subramanian had sent a tentative October 3rd sentencing date for Diddy on his convictions of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Remember, that's what he was convicted of. He was acquitted of racketeering conspiracy, and he was acquitted of the 2 sex trafficking counts. But he was convicted of these prostitution charges. And at one point, there was reporting that defense counsel for Sean Combs and prosecutors, they had then agreed to switch the date to September 22nd. And we thought, okay, because today's hearing was supposed to be about expediting the October hearing. Then they agreed to September 22nd. Now apparently it's back to October 3rd. This is all over the place. Very confusing. We'll get it straightened out. I gotta say it's interesting because Combs' defense counsel had originally stated last week, when it was the October 3rd date, that they wanted that sentencing expedited, meaning they wanted it to happen sooner. And one of the things that Sean Combs' attorney, Mark Agnifilo, had said was, quote, the mother of some of his children had passed away many years ago. These kids, the 2 daughters here sitting in the middle of Your Honor's second row, don't have a parent. Obviously referring to the death of Kim Porter in 2018, mother of Christian, Jesse, Delilah, Quincy. And by the way, remember Sean Combs was denied bail, so it wasn't even like he got to go home after the verdict, but clearly they wanted this expedited. They want his sentencing to happen as quickly as possible. They want him out of jail. They want him out of prison as soon as possible. And also it's interesting because prosecutors, they need time for the pre-sentencing investigation and report. Basically, that's when a probation officer interviews the defendant, looks at the history, the background, childhood, education, employment, criminal history, finances, the mental and physical health of the defendant. There are interviews that are conducted with family and friends. The officer looks at various court and school records, employment records, financial records. The officer could speak to the victims in the case, law enforcement that were involved in the investigation, provide all of this information in a report to the judge, because here the judge is going to have a lot of discretion when it comes to the sentence. What could a sentence look like? Well, prosecutors indicated in a filing that before even doing a pre-sentencing investigation, Combs is looking at 51 to 63 months, a little over 4 to 5 years in prison. The defense seems to be pushing for 21 to 27 months, so a little over 1.5 to 2 years. But remember, Combs has been sitting in federal lockup since September at the MDC. So if he gets time served, he really wouldn't be spending that much time behind bars. Now, of course, there are the extremes. When you talk about transportation to engage in prostitution, the maximum for each count is 10 years in prison. You stack them together, you get 20 years. Okay, based upon the facts in this case, it seems highly unlikely he would get that much. Other side, you get the idea. There's no minimum for this charge. So could he get time served and walk free? Also seems unlikely, in that you're dealing with multiple instances of transporting Jane and Cassie.
But the latest emotional and public developments involve his daughters, specifically the twins, Delilah and Jesse, and their sister, Chance. These young women have been forced to process their father's conviction for transportation to engage in prostitution, and the graphic, horrific details revealed in court. And now, the true cost of their father's legacy is emerging as Diddy loses control over his life, and his daughters make a shocking confession about their father that fundamentally changes the narrative of the Combs family. This confession is not delivered through a formal press conference or a lawsuit. It's delivered through the heartbreaking lens of public behavior and court records, an agonizing, unspoken admission of what they have been forced to endure. Remember the sight: Chance, Delilah, and Jesse, all young women, dressing impeccably, sitting silently in the courtroom during their father's criminal trial. They came to show solidarity, a united front against the storm, but that wall of defense collapsed in the face of brutal, unforgiving testimony. The shock.
In a while, and you did great reporting. You're here. We did sidebar recaps every day. Yeah. Okay, before we get into this monumental hearing, and I'm being sarcastic, you'll see in a second. Combs' defense counsel filed a letter with the court that outlined a brand new schedule. Then after the hearing, it was changed. What was the back and forth in terms of schedules? What's happening now?
I know. To your point, Jesse, it really was a back and forth. First, it was September 22nd. Now it's October 3rd. And it was something that the judge initially put on the schedule as Diddy's sentencing hearing. And then, back and forth happened. And now it's back to October 3rd, which I like to call Mean Girls Day. And so it was a lot of kind of going on here. And a lot of us were kind of confused as to, is it going to be September? Is it going to be October? But now it's official. It's going to be October. And there's a reason for it. There's a lot of stuff, like you had just mentioned, that both sides have to kind of work through. The defense was proposing that the probation office provide the parties with a pre-sentence investigation report, or a PSR, on or before August 29th. The defense objections to the PSR report will be filed on or before September 5th. And so a bunch of documents need to be filed. Diddy needs to be interviewed. Other people need to be interviewed. But it looks like we'll hear that sentencing hearing on October 3rd. It'll be kind of a big bow to a very long case. We'll see what the judge kind of goes for in terms of the sentencing. It could be, like you had mentioned, to the lower side, to the higher side. But I hate guessing in this trial at this point, because every guess that I've made has been completely wrong. So.
No, we both agreed he would get convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution, racketeering, sex trafficking, both up in the air. I'm not surprised by the jury's decision, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and Jesse, just some more to the schedule. For any post-verdict motions, the parties proposed that the defense file any post-verdict motions on or before July 30th of this year, and the government respond on or before August 20th. And then the government requests that if they be permitted to submit its summary of offense conduct on or before July 11th of 2025, and the defense doesn't object to that. So we'll see a lot more documents being filed that we're able to kind of talk about, hopefully a little bit more, but it seems that it's just a bunch of documents that'll be filed before the eventual sentencing hearing.
You know what I think is interesting? The post-trial motions. So typically speaking, those could be like a motion for a new trial, where the court would vacate the judgment and allow for a new trial, rarely granted, but may be done if the interest of justice so requires. There's a motion for judgment of acquittal, so the court could set aside the jury's verdict, allow the defendant to go free. And there's a motion to vacate, set aside, or correct a sentence, and I'm told that it's often successful for the purpose of correcting when there's a clerical error in the sentence. Now, assuming Combs has valid legal grounds to support any of this, I imagine he will file whatever motion he can for relief from either the verdict or the sentence. Then again, I don't know. He got a very favorable ruling. Yeah. Obviously, he was convicted. He's not entirely happy with it, and his defense counsel explained that. But they also, in their press conference after the verdict, they were jubilant. They were ecstatic. Yeah. And I wonder if he gets a favorable sentence, is he even going to challenge this? I mean, they seem happy.
Yeah, they seem ecstatic, because the emotions that kind of ran outside of the courtroom, it was kind of double that inside the courtroom, where all the defense attorneys were hugging, they were crying. So seeing them outside in the press conference, all kind of holding hands, going up, that was just a little slice of the cake from what we all saw inside that federal courtroom. But I think it can kind of go both ways, and that's mainly because Sean Combs is still behind bars right now. The judge didn't grant him bail even after the verdict, and I think his reasoning might give us a little kind of picture into what the sentencing might possibly look like, because the judge even pointed out during his denying of Diddy's bail after his conviction, which were on counts 3 and 5, kind of talking back to what had happened in June of 2024 with Jane and the violent altercation that happened over at Jane's apartment. And so I'm thinking, if the judge's
confession was not a spoken one, it was an action. Courtroom reporting from the trial confirmed that Diddy's daughters were forced to abruptly excuse themselves from the courtroom during graphic testimony, specifically, during the explicit recounting of events involving male escort Daniel Phillip, including lurid details about their father allegedly watching, and physical abuse. The young women were unable to remain seated. They stood, visibly distressed and heartbroken, and walked out. They did this not once, but repeatedly, during the most graphic, gut-wrenching accounts. This public, visceral reaction is the shocking confession. It is the agonizing admission that the man they knew, the father who showered them with luxury and public affection, was revealed in that room to be a monster whose alleged actions were so dark, so vile, that his own children could not physically endure the hearing of them. It exposed the painful, undeniable truth. The public facade they were maintaining for their father had finally shattered under the weight of the evidence. This moment changed everything.
Already kind of on his mind about the whole domestic violence aspect and the physical violence that was exuded from the defendant even just last year. I think it's possible maybe the judge, even if he hears from the family, even if he hears from Sean Combs's friends, that it's possible it might be kind of a little bit of a tougher sentence than maybe the defense was expecting.
Well, look, I think the defense might be wanting to take advantage of this, right? Now, the judge said, even though I'm denying bail and I'm looking at the violence factor, it's not a preview of what I'm going to do for sentencing. But I think this is the opportunity for the defense to submit any kind of mitigating factors and have the probation officer speak to his friends and family and talk about the impact of this. I mean, we just interviewed Charlucci the other day. So I wonder if they're saying, you know what? They said to Sean Combs, listen, let's wait for October. Gives us more time to present our case to Judge Arun Subramanian. And then we had the hearing today. This monumental hearing.
Was great.
You've been in court for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
This was what, like 7 seconds?
I think maybe even less than, I would say,
What
kind
happened?
of close to 5 minutes. So
Yeah.
get all the way down to the courthouse. I'm like seeing everybody
Which
from
is not
the trial.
close from here, so people know.
it's
Yeah.
not. It's not. And it was hot outside too. So
all the way downtown,
walking
yeah.
all the way down, or not, I didn't walk all the way downtown, from the subway to the walk to the courthouse.
Okay.
Get there, check in on my stuff. I would say the security check-in was longer than the actual hearing.
Okay.
So it was a remote hearing. We didn't see Sean Combs in person. We didn't see any of the attorneys on both sides. We didn't even see the judge. And so what had happened was we get inside kind of the overflow room.
Oh, the overflow room, okay.
Yep. So we get inside the overflow room. There's a big giant screen. It's completely black, but then you hear Sean Combs's voice being like, Mark, are you there? And so it was kind of like one of those dial-in type of hearings. And so we heard Mark Agnifalo's voice. Then all of a sudden we hear the prosecution's voice. It was Christy Slavic. She was accompanied by Emily Johnson, both who work on behalf of the government. And then all of a sudden, Mark Agnifalo was kind of like, you know what, we were able to work everything out as far as our sentencing date goes. And then the judge's clerk is like, oh, okay, so both parties agree, and then this matter is adjourned.
And that was it.
Yeah.
I worried that's what was going to be because when they had the letter basically working out the date, I was like, oh, what are they going to talk
Yeah.
about? And then after that hearing is when they switched it back to October 3rd.
Yeah.
So not much there. You didn't see Sean Combs. Okay, let's talk about some other things that have been going on. First of all, big news. There's a new lawsuit that came out against Sean Combs, okay? This is pretty disgusting. You have this unidentified John Doe who claims that in September of 2020, so relatively recently, he, Diddy, and others, they go to this warehouse out in LA that apparently contains some of the clothes of Notorious B.I.G., the rapper who was shot and killed in 1997, Sean Combs' friend. And people start taking drugs. They start wandering around this warehouse. And this John Doe claims that Combs started watching pornography on his phone. And that is when he claims, again, warning, pretty disgusting allegation, that Combs grabbed one of Biggie's t-shirts and pleasured himself with it, into it. I don't know how the best way to explain it. And even alleging that John Doe, or insisting that John Doe finish the job, so to speak. And he then claimed Combs threw the spoiled shirt onto John Doe and said, "Rip Biggie," then left. He also claimed that 15 years earlier, Combs told him to perform oral sex on him, reportedly suing for intentional infliction of emotional distress, sexual battery. Don't have a ton of information, but for somebody who has been following so many of the civil lawsuits that he now faces, 66, 67, 68, how does this fit into all of them?
Well, it seems like it's just kind of showing a pattern that all the lawsuits seem to kind of allege of power.
For Diddy. Before that, he could cling to the narrative of a victim of a media circus, a man wrongly accused, but when his own daughter's tears and walkouts became the most compelling testimony against him, Diddy lost his final shield. He lost the ability to pretend that the accusations were just false narratives, as he and his family had initially claimed in a joint statement supporting him. The stress on these young women has been immense. They released a joint statement earlier in the legal process, standing united and stating they hold on to the truth, knowing it will prevail. But the truth that prevailed was the one that drove them from the courtroom in tears. The confession is the trauma now written on their faces. The tragic fallout from Sean Diddy Combs' catastrophic choices has now hit the most protected part of his life, his daughters, the young women who stood by their father, defending his name against the deluge of accusations, were ultimately forced to confront the unspeakable reality of his alleged life. For Diddy, The collapse began.
Power, control, sexual pleasure, all of that stuff. I would say the timing of it is a little surprising given that it came after the verdict a little bit, but I think it kind of, again, goes to that pattern that a lot of the other civil suits we've seen, and these can be by just different attorneys too. It's not always the same attorney who's filing these suits, but it seems like they all kind of go to this pattern, it seems. But again, I'm just more surprised at the timing of it and when this was filed too.
To be clear, there are lawsuits that he's facing that contain allegations that were never discussed in any way in the criminal case.
Right.
But in the criminal case, was it ever alleged that he sexually assaulted men? Was it ever alleged that he grabbed men or forced them to do things, or was it mostly focused upon women?
Seems like it was mostly focused on women and that being the victims in this case. I think as far as just kind of the allegations towards men were really just having to do with the escorts or the entertainers, as they were also called in the criminal trial. But for the most part, it seemed like from what we heard in the criminal trial, which I know a lot of people are a little disappointed because they thought it would be a lot more, but really it was just kind of like just different isolated incidents involving two victims, being Jane and Cassie. But it seemed like there wasn't a lot of discussion about male victims in this trial, but there were little points that were brought up in terms of like the civil matters, those including like Bonna and her civil claim, Dawn Richard and her civil claim. I think even during the cross-examination of Cassie, one of the defense attorneys, that would be Anna Esteval, she had asked, you know, was the baby oil laced? And I was thinking back to the civil claims, because a lot of civil claims had, a lot of civil suits had claimed that
And it wasn't laced.
That it was, the civil suits claimed it was laced, but then in the criminal trial, Cassie had confirmed that the baby oil was never laced with any type of narcotics or anything like that.
By the way, Combs' legal team said in a statement to Page 6, quote, Mr. Combs' trial and acquittal on trafficking and RICO charges proves what we have been saying all along. Mr. Combs never sexually assaulted or trafficked anyone. That people continue to broadcast and file false accusations, no matter how heinous and uncorroborated, is unfortunate. But Mr. Combs will not back down. He will fight for as long as necessary to win his full vindication. I talked about it on a previous sidebar how he might tackle all these lawsuits, maybe motions to dismiss, maybe try to say, you know, these Jane and John Doe shouldn't proceed under pseudonyms. If you can convince a court of that, they may be reluctant to continue the case if they have to expose their identities. He might try to get rid of them at initial stages as much as possible.
And he was successful at that at the beginning too.
Yeah, a few of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about the jurors, okay? So first, a juror has spoken out since the verdict. Not surprising, we had a feeling this would happen. This unnamed juror apparently spoke to ABC and said that the public reaction to this decision, quote, is highly insulting and belittling to the jury and the deliberation process. We spent over 2 days deliberating. Our decision was based solely on the evidence presented and how the law is stated. We would have treated any defendant in the same manner regardless of who they are. I have nothing else to say. Now, you watched the jury, okay? And we'll talk about what an alternate juror had to say too, but you watched the jury. You watched them day in and day out. What do you make of that statement?
I was a little surprised by
Really?
that statement, just a little bit, only because, and I shouldn't say anything surprising to me when it comes to this trial, I found that statement surprising only because we clearly had heard the same evidence. Obviously, they saw a little bit more than I saw being inside the gallery. Some of the exhibits we weren't able to see, that sort, and that included, you know, the freak-off tapes, the hotel night tapes, all of that stuff. And so I was surprised by the jury's decision. It's mainly to count two, not as surprising.
Sex trafficking.
Yeah, sex trafficking.
And when his daughters made a shocking, visceral confession about their father in court that fundamentally changes the narrative of the entire Combs family tragedy. The man known for his control and power lost the one thing he couldn't buy or intimidate, the ability to shield his children from the horrifying truth. The world watched as Chance, Delilah, and Jessie, Diddy's daughters, maintained a stoic, unified presence in the Manhattan courtroom during their father's criminal proceedings. They were there, impeccably dressed, to offer their silent, steadfast support. That shield of solidarity, however, proved fatally fragile when confronted by the brutal, graphic, and clinical presentation of the evidence. The moment of the shocking confession was not a spoken word. It was an agonized, physical retreat. Courtroom reports detail the devastating scene. The young women were forced to abruptly excuse themselves and walk out of the courtroom during the explicit testimony of a male escort. The testimony, delivered by Daniel Phillip, Detailed lurid alleged.
So the defense is kind of arguing that the government should have stopped when they just said that the fingerprint cards were destroyed. They should have just stopped there. They shouldn't have continued insinuating in a way that they were ordered to be destroyed by a particular someone. And so the government comes back. They say no prejudice, or excuse me, there was no prejudice that should cause or would cause a mistrial, and that the government needed to elicit this testimony about the fingerprints, and they said that they came to a resolution that they're okay with it just being struck from the record. And so the judge denied the application for a mistrial and said that the jury will just disregard the statements from the attorneys as evidence, and will disregard the statements made by Officer Lance Jimenez, or excuse me, Investigator Lance Jimenez.
And that's what he did. He told the jury to disregard it. Easier said than done. We'll see if they disregard it. But also you have to wonder if the jury will make that connection that the defense made about, you know, who might have been responsible or behind the evidence being destroyed. And by the way, there might not be anything nefarious about this. Jimenez was cross-examined, though, by the defense. What were some of the highlights there?
Yeah, so he was cross-examined by Mark Agnifilo, and so starting off the bat, we kind of see the inside of the Porsche where you can see the bottle. They, of course, are going to touch upon the fact that this DNA profile came back as a female, and that's what Agnifilo went with. The report says it's female DNA on the bottle. Jimenez says, yes, you sent the glass bottle for DNA testing. He said he didn't. Jimenez didn't know who had actually sent this report in, and maintains that it was just a partial DNA profile that was found. And obviously that's kind of above me as far as DNA and just everything that works with that. But then the defense is asking whether or not they reached out to Capricorn Clark. And I thought maybe this was a moment they were going to try to insinuate that maybe she was the one who was behind, or maybe she was the one who had the partial DNA, female DNA profile on that bottle. And so then Jimenez said that he didn't recall when the report came back. We see another exhibit photo of the glass bottle inside the Porsche, and Agnifilo is asking about his opinion on whether the glass bottle was the cause of the fire, and Jimenez had, verified yes. And so there were other moments where you had seen a glove even in the back seat of the car. And it was interesting because I think the defense was implying that, why didn't you test this glove for DNA? Jimenez had said that he believed that the glove belonged to the owner of the vehicle, obviously the owner of the vehicle being Kid Cudi, so didn't think it was relevant or necessary to turn it back for evidence. But Mark Agnifilo was really like, well, where's the other glove? Do you know where the other glove is? And if a bottle is super hot, wouldn't you be the one using a glove if you were going to do something like this? And Jimenez kind of came back and said, well, not really. And Agnifilo was like, well, wouldn't the bottle be hot? And he said no, because the cloth would be on fire. And I felt like Agnifilo was trying to argue with a fire expert, an arson investigator.
Basically trying to make the idea that it was a sloppy investigation.
Yes.
You don't really know who
Exactly.
set fire to this car, and let alone Sean Combs or an associate of his.
Yes, exactly. And so we're seeing more exhibit photos, kind of the same photos that we were seeing under direct, the roof cut out, Kid Cudi's Porsche a number of times, just whether or not if he could tell that the damage was from the heat and the heat actually rose from the vehicle. Then the defense kind of gets into Kid Cudi's other Porsche and whether or not the other Porsche should have been included in the report. And he said it wasn't relevant because this particular other Porsche was in the garage, and he said that it's like adding furniture in the home in the report, that it wasn't necessary for him to include that. And so I think as far as the cross ending, Agnifilo was really kind of honing in on who Investigator Jimenez had spoken to as far as just reaching out to as far as potential witnesses or suspects and that type of thing. And so
alleged events involving Diddy's ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Cassie Ventura, including graphic sexual acts that Diddy allegedly watched, pleasuring himself in the corner, and accounts of alleged physical violence. This public, visceral reaction is the shocking, unspoken confession. It is the agonizing admission that the father they loved, the man who built an empire for them, was revealed in that room to be capable of actions so depraved, so psychologically wrenching, that his own children could not physically endure the hearing of the details. The visual of these young women, reportedly having to stand and exit the courtroom not once, but repeatedly, during the most harrowing accounts of their father's alleged conduct, shattered the last shred of pretense. The public silence Diddy demanded from his children, the forced participation in the narrative of the supportive family, finally broke. Their tears and their retreat exposed the painful, undeniable truth. The accusations were not just fictitious or a shakedown, as Diddy's legal team had claimed. They were, in the eyes of his children, too horrifyingly real to bear. This emotional and public trauma changes everything for Diddy. before the
Investigator Jimenez did say that he had reached out to both Cassie and Capricorn Clark, because when Capricorn Clark had testified, she had said that she didn't respond to investigators' calls, something that Jimenez verified, that he called a bunch of times. He went over and did door knocking to her house. He had got a hold of her, in quotations, one time, and it was actually her brother who answered the phone, and her brother told Investigator Jimenez to leave her alone, and that was just kind of where we got to, just as far as Capricorn Clark is concerned. But as far as Cassie is concerned, it was the same thing, reaching out to her, trying to find her address. She said, or excuse me, Investigator Jimenez said that he even got in touch with Cassie's father, and that Cassie's father was going to try to get her in touch with the investigator. But I think it also goes to show that no one was very cooperative in this investigation, something that I think also was verified under Capricorn Clark's testimony, Kid Cudi's testimony, where it was just kind of like, we're not going to talk about this with investigators. We're not going to talk about this with officials. We're going to keep our mouth shut and not cooperate with this investigation.
You also wonder if that helps the prosecution, because a big theme of this is, why didn't Cassie step forward? Why didn't she speak? Why didn't she report anything? And the idea is the power, the control, the influence, the resources of Sean Combs. Are you really going to go after him? I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the testimony from Dawn Richard about her witnessing Cassie being beaten by Combs in front of high-powered celebrities and no one steps in, that's an important consideration if you think about, well, what could Cassie do in that position, the power dynamic. So I wonder what the jury takes away from that. But okay, so it was a lot about Kid Cudi.
Yes.
But then we go on to another witness. We go on to this celebrity stylist, Deontay Nash, okay? Had been a stylist for Cassie and Combs. Now here's the thing. I'm reading the reporting of his testimony. And just me reading the transcript of the testimony, I could tell this guy has a ton of personality.
Yes, absolutely.
So what was his connection? What did you take away from his testimony? What was he like? What was his vibe like?
Oh, his vibe was awesome, I think. He really, for the most part, he started off pretty funny. He makes this joke, because we see this exhibit photo of Deontay's headshot, and Deontay's explaining, yes, that's me, and that I look amazing. And this photo, the courtroom erupts with laughter. I think I even spotted Diddy kind of chuckling along too. It was a funny moment, but then it kind of got a lot more serious. And obviously, there were moments where they were talking about domestic violence or physical violence, from Diddy to Cassie, just the names he would call her. And so after we had this funny moment in court, Deontay Nash was explaining just his work history, that he had styled Diddy and Cassie starting in 2008 all the way up until 2018. He started off as an intern for Derek Roche, who was actually Diddy's stylist. While Deontay Nash is on the witness stand, he actually refers to Diddy not as Sean Combs or Sean or anything like that. He refers to him as Puff or Puffy, one of the many names that Diddy has gone by in the past. And so he worked with Diddy and Cassie from 2008 to 2018. And then from 2009 to 2018, he said he spent a lot of time with Cassie particularly, that they went everywhere together, that he actually is Cassie's best friend, and that they even talk to one another to this day. And so he testified that he saw Diddy and Cassie together at least once a week, so pretty frequently. But then he was asked some of the names that Diddy called her. And so he starts off with, baby girl, Cassie, Cass. But then he says that Diddy would refer to her as the B word and SLUT and sometimes a hoe, and that he used the B word often when describing Cassie. Deontay had said that was his favorite word to use. And so Deontay said that Cassie would get pretty sad and depressed about all the name calling. And then Deontay kind of goes into the threats that Diddy had made, where he had threatened to send Cassie.
He could still cling to the illusion that the family unit was intact, that his children stood fully and blindly behind him. But the moment his daughter's trauma became the most compelling, visible evidence in the courtroom, Diddy lost his final, most vital defense. He lost the ability to convince the public, and perhaps himself, that the image of the loving father was stronger than the reality of the mogul's dark empire. The young women have been trapped in this catastrophic fallout for months. They previously issued a joint statement to the media, standing by their father and stating they hold on to the truth, knowing it will prevail. But the truth that ultimately prevailed was the one that drove them from the courtroom in visible distress. This is the enduring confession, the total, agonizing collapse of trust and love, replaced by a trauma that will forever be associated with their father's final, public ruin. The financial and criminal collapse is one thing, The emotional wreckage inflicted on his daughters is the permanent stain on the Combs legacy. Diddy has lost not just his freedom and his empire, but the one thing that mattered most, the simple, untainted pride of his children. Furthermore, they have been forced to publicly defend their late mother, Kim Porter, against exploitation, when a posthumous memoir containing shocking, unverified claims about Diddy's violence towards Porter emerged. The children had to issue a devastating joint statement calling the book fake and begging for their mother's memory to be protected from horrific conspiracy theories. This act of desperately shielding their mother's memory while their father faced his own criminal reality further illustrates the family's total, agonizing collapse. The girls are now navigating a world where their father is an incarcerated felon, stripped of his empire and his reputation. Their shocking confession, that they simply could not listen to the details of his dark life, is the sound of their family name being permanently broken. Diddy has lost not just his freedom and his fortune, but the last vestige of pure, untainted love and respect from his children, replaced by a trauma that will forever define their legacy.